So the way trade has been presented so far, it looks like everybody benefits. And yet what we've seen politically is that trade and increase in globalization has often led to a lot of conflict within countries and between countries. And so the reason for that is that trade creates both winners and losers. And so we want to think about what happens because of an increase in trade, both in the short run and then in the long run. So what we've seen already is that opening up trade increases our consumption possibility set, right? So now we can consume more. If we think about the United States and say increase in trade with a country like China, then a lot of our manufactured goods, whether it's toys or clothes or cell phones or computers or whatever, have become cheaper, right? Become less expensive. On the other hand, on the other side are the workers that used to make those products in the United States but are no longer making those products. And so when we think about the winners and losers, what we want to think about is the relative factors of production between two countries. And so is a country have an abundance of a certain factor or a scarcity of a certain factor? And it's all relative, right? So we can think about, with a big country like the US trading with a smaller country like Belgium, or even, a large country like the US trading with an even larger country, at least in terms of population, like China or India. And so what's going to happen in the short run in terms of trade depends on that relative scarcity. We can think about skilled labor, unskilled labor, and capital, and also think about sort of the price of those relatively scarce factors. So if we think about just a hypothetical example between the US and China, then over here we have China and the US before trade, and we're just going to assume that there are two types of goods. So one is passenger aircraft and one is consumer electronics. And the idea is that the passenger aircraft is a capital intensive good, whereas consumer electronics are a labor intensive good. So before trade, US workers are getting 75% of the pie, and we'll just normalize the pie to one. And capital owners, profits, are getting 25% of the pie. Whereas in China, workers are getting 50% and capital owners are getting 50%. Well, when we start trading between these two countries, China has a relative abundance of lower skilled workers, whereas the US has a relative abundance of capital. And so that means that the winners in the US are going to be the owners of capital, and the winners in China are going to be workers. Now, that said, the increase in trade does increase the total size of the pie, right? Because we're specializing in what we have the lower opportunity cost, the comparative advantage in. And so the size of the pie grows for both countries. So the US goes from 1 to 1.3. Remember, these are just hypothetical examples. So it's grown by 30%, and China has grown by 40%. Now, it's possible that everybody benefits, right? It's certainly possible that both labor and capital benefit in both countries, but it's also possible that the capitalists benefit so much more in the US that not only does their percentage of the pie grow, so now they have 45% instead of 25%, um, but that the absolute share of workers has shrunk, right? So now not only are they getting less percentage of the pie, 75%, 55%, but now their actual absolute real wage has shrunk from 0.75 to 0.72. Whereas for both workers and capitalists in China, they've both benefited. So the capitalists have gone from 50% to 40%, but their absolute share has grown from 0.5 to 0.56. And workers have gone from 50% to 60%, and they've gone from 0.5 to 0.84. And so this is obviously just a hypothetical example, but the idea is that it's possible for workers in one country to actually be hurt by trade. And this is what is known as the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And it's certainly possible that that's what we've seen. There was a very influential paper in economics that came out in the last few years called the China Shock. And what it found was that areas in the US that used to produce products that are now produced in China have seen higher unemployment rates, lower wages, and so have been hurt more than a lot of economists would have thought. In the long run, it really depends on what happens to the wage setting curve. So after specialization, we should see an increase in how much each worker produces, right? So that should increase the price setting curve. And so if the wage setting curve doesn't change at all, we know that that should lead to higher wages and a lower unemployment benefit a lower unemployment rate. But if we do see the wage setting curve shift up, maybe because we're trying to protect workers who would lose their jobs, or because we're giving them higher unemployment benefits or whatever, then we could see even a higher unemployment rate, say a point E, or just a less of a decrease in the unemployment rate, say a point F. But in the short run, jobs are destroyed, right? And so we've seen that, and that has been a clear picture of globalization. Factories shutting down, moving to Mexico, moving to China. But of course, that's been happening throughout capitalism, right? So if you think about the textile industry, that grew up in New England, in places like Lowell and Lawrence and Fall River and New Bedford, they shut down. They moved to the south. They lasted for a while in the southern United States. Then they shut down, moved to other places in the United States. And then they shut down and moved to places like Mexico, places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic. Then they moved to places like Taiwan, Thailand, and now they're in places like Bangladesh, right? Always searching for lower cost labor. Now, the United States is not necessarily worse off because we don't have those textile jobs anymore because those are low paying jobs, and we wouldn't necessarily want them. But there is this short run cost, right? There is this increase in unemployment benefits as those jobs are destroyed. If we think about the effects of migration in the long run, we sort of already saw this in chapter 9. And so in the short run, assuming that all those immigrants are unemployed, and that's not necessarily a reasonable assumption, but we get that drop in the real wage and an increase in the unemployment rate, right, from U to U prime. But then we get a shift out in the wage setting curve after immigration, and because wages are lower, we get more firms hiring, and the real wage goes back up to where it was before, and the unemployment rate goes back to where it was as well. But again, that's a long-term process, and there can be short-term costs. What we've seen in the United States is that there's very little evidence of that drop in wages from A to B, but there does seem always to be political pressure. There always seems to be feeling that immigrants are keeping wages down, whether they are or not. So governments, faced with these short-run costs, often have political pressure to limit globalization, either by putting tariffs on to protect industries within the country, putting tighter immigration policies in to protect workers, putting capital controls on so that capital can't move around as freely, or using monetary policy to affect the exchange rate and try to boost exports and limit imports. And some of these can help smooth out some of the sort of volatility of trade. But if you put them in too much, then you're not going to get that benefit of trade, that benefit of specialization, that increase in how much workers produce.